Okay, let's move on. So those of you that have got your quizzes out, if you can put them away. And we're on to this page. Okay? So remember we looking at the New Testament. So where we're up to is these yellow books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're the forced. That was me saying first and fourth. First and four at the same time. They're the first 4 books of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, Matthew was written second, historically. Mark was written first. Luke was written third. John was written last, between those 4 books. Matthew was written for Jewish believers. Mark was written for Roman believers. Luke was written for non-Jewish believers. John was written for everyone. And then that's kind of the time period where we think they were written. Around about 75 to 80 AD, which was about 40 years after Jesus went to heaven. Okay? Second row under that. So Matthew was a disciple of Jesus. His name is in the Bible as Matthew or as Levi, and he was a tax collector. Mark did not know Jesus personally. He was not a disciple, but he was a disciple of Peter later on. So some of Peter's story and memory you see in the book of Mark. Luke did not know Jesus personally either, but he researched many people's stories. You can see more of Mary's story in there. And he was a physician or a doctor, so he had a lot of eye for detail, which is why it's the biggest and the longest of all of those Gospels. And then John was a close disciple of Jesus. In the Bible, he's just referred to as John, or John the Beloved, or the one who Jesus loved, and his job before that was a fisherman. After Jesus, Matthew was a part of spreading the good news of the kingdom to the Jewish people. Mark, there's a funny story in the book of Mark when Jesus is taken captive before he is crucified. There's this weird story about this man that's in the bushes watching him being captured, and he's scared and he runs away, and his tunic falls off and he runs away naked. It's a really odd story. It doesn't make any sense for why it's in there unless that was Mark, and he inserted that strange little story because he was an eyewitness of something that happened. It's quite interesting, because it's possible that Mark's family was the family that had the room that they used for the Last Supper, potentially. Okay, Luke, you can read about Luke in the book of Acts, because Luke wrote the book of Luke and the book of Acts, and he's in the book of Acts, and we'll get to the book of Acts soon. He traveled with Paul, who is in the book of Acts, so we'll get to that soon. John stayed more within the Judea-Israel area, but he was arrested when he was a lot older, and he was imprisoned. He was put on an island, and he did a lot of his writing from the island, and he's the one that wrote the letters 1, 2, and 3 John, and he also wrote the book of Revelation. So in the book of Matthew, you read about Jesus' ancestry back to Abraham, because Abraham's really important to the Jews, and Matthew's writing to the Jewish people. Mark doesn't mention Jesus' ancestry at all. It's not important to his book. Luke does. He goes all the way back to Adam, because Luke's about all of humanity. And then John talks about Jesus' divinity, about how he's eternal. So John's concerned about us knowing that Jesus is divine. Matthew talks about a lot of healings. He talks a lot about fulfilled prophecies because he's talking to the Jews. Mark is like more about what happened around the time of Jesus' death. Luke does a lot of healings and compassion stories, the poor. And then John does a lot more of Jesus' teachings and words and not many miracles. So if you read the book of Matthew, if you want to know what was Jesus' teachings like that I can be discipled by, and if I follow them, I will live more like Jesus, you want to read the book of Matthew. It's got the Sermon on the Mount and things like that. Mark is like this little action book. And then suddenly this happened. And then immediately that happened. So if you want to read like a bit more of action, you would read Mark. Luke's got the details. And then John is talking about the relational side of Jesus. Okay, we'll go on to that's the end of the Gospels. I'm not going into them anymore. So we're going to go on to the book of Acts. So Jesus, at the start of the book of Acts, Jesus is still with them and gives them his last instructions. And then he is taken up into clouds to heaven. And his last instruction was to say to them, stay in Jerusalem, wait for Holy Spirit. He's going to empower you to spread my kingdom. So they do that. And in Acts chapter 2, the Holy Spirit comes upon them. And one of the expressions of that is they started to speak in tongues. And they were full of joy, and they went outside and they were just speaking in tongues. And there were people that were in Jerusalem at that time from all over the region. These are all the places they came from, and they were in Jerusalem because it was time of the festival for Pentecost. So they were there to celebrate the Pentecost festival, and suddenly all these people are coming out and speaking in tongues. But the thing that was really cool was that the tongues they were speaking were in those languages. And so these fishermen that had never learnt other languages are now suddenly speaking languages that belong to all of these people groups because Holy Spirit was giving it to them supernaturally. And they were speaking about who Jesus was. And on that day, 3,000 people became believers of Jesus just through seeing the miracle of these fishermen and tax collectors speaking about Jesus in all their different languages. So that's at the beginning of the book of Acts. So the disciples then go and they do a lot of healing, they do a lot of preaching, and the Jewish leaders who have just crucified Jesus are still really annoyed with this new movement, and they want to squash it. So they persecute these believers, which means they make things really hard for them. They imprison them, they flog them, they were even killing some of them. So this picture represents the story of Stephen. That's Stephen there on his knees, and he was a believer in Jesus, and they told him, be quiet, stop preaching, stop telling us about Jesus, and he refused to. They picked up stones and threw stones at him until he died. So that's what's called stoning someone to death, and that was a common thing that people did in the olden days as a form of punishment. So Stephen got stoned to death. You can see this man standing on the side there with robes and clothes at his feet, and that man is Saul. He was a Jewish disciple of the Pharisees, or the Jewish leaders, and he was agreeing with the death of Stephen. He hated these new believers in Jesus, and he wanted to get rid of them. Okay. So Saul then got permission from the leaders to travel around various places from Jerusalem to other places to imprison Christians and to beat them up and to tell them to be quiet and to stop spreading the good news. But on the way to Damascus, he had an experience with Jesus that he wasn't expecting. Now remember, Jesus not on earth anymore, but what happened was a blinding light just out of nowhere while Saul was riding on his donkey or horse, and he fell off, and it was so blinding that he literally went blind, and he heard Jesus speak to him. Jesus said, I am Jesus that you're persecuting, and he was basically saying to Saul, you need to cut it out. You're going to get to Damascus. I want you to stay in a house. I'm going to send someone to you who will tell you more about me. So the guys that were with Saul helped him because now he's blind. He can't see anything. He's scared. And he's just had this experience that he doesn't understand with Jesus speaking to him, who he's just been trying to kill heaps of Jesus's followers. So he gets to Damascus and he stays in this house. And a God tells one of the men in Damascus to go and visit Saul and pray for him so he'll get healed. So the man was scared because he knows Saul is someone that might kill me, but he goes and he's obedient to God. So Saul actually becomes a follower of Jesus because of this crazy experience that he has. And then he does, he really reads through the Old Testament because he's a Jew and he's a Pharisee Jew, so he knows that Old Testament really well. He starts reading it with new eyes, looking for what the prophecies were about Jesus and learning a lot more. And he did that for 14 years, and then he started speaking about Jesus to many people throughout the Middle East and changed his name to Paul. So in the Bible, when you see in the New Testament, Saul means, it's a name that means something like great or big or something like that. Paul means little. So he changed his name to Paul to symbolize, I'm being humble, I'm coming under God. And so so we're in the book of Acts. This is all the stories about that time period. And we turn and the road to Damascus, and then Paul and Luke tells us about that story. But most of these books, all of these books, Paul wrote. So these are all letters to different churches or different people, and it's instructions by Paul. So those blue books. The red ones are written by other people. So Paul actually ended up writing most of the New Testament, or about half of the books. Paul did some journeys. So here's Jerusalem down at the bottom on the right. Paul spent most of his time further north in Antioch, and then he did these journeys across Asia Minor and southern Europe. So he did 3 massive journeys that are spoken about in the book of Acts, and lots of crazy stuff happens to him. So this diagram here shows you that the green represents the whole book of Acts, if you were to read it from start to finish. Paul wrote these books of the Bible during those times in the book of Acts. He's in prison from after chapter 21, but he's written these books before he's in prison. And I want to read to you what he says in the book of 2 Corinthians. So it's on this page. And it says, these are some of the hardships that have happened to Paul. This is him writing to the church at Corinth. In verse 24 it says, 5 times I've received 39 lashes from the Jewish leaders. So the lashes is when they whipped him with, it was really intense, like leather with bone and other stuff inside of it. So when it was whipped against you, it actually pulled some of your skin. And they had this idea that if you were whipped 40 times, you would die. So they would whip you 39 times so you didn't. That was the idea behind it. So 5 times he went through that from the Jewish leaders. 3 times I experienced being beaten with rods. Once they stoned me, but he obviously got away and he didn't die. 3 times I've been shipwrecked. For an entire night and a day I was adrift in the open sea. In my difficult travels I've faced many dangerous situations, perilous rivers, robbers, foreigners, even my own people. I've survived deadly peril in the city, in the wilderness, with storms at sea, and with spies posing as believers. I've toiled to the point of exhaustion and gone through many sleepless nights. I've frequently been deprived of food and water, left hungry and shivering out in the cold, lacking proper clothing. Once when I was in Damascus, the governor under King Aretas had his troops searching for me to have me arrested, but I was stuffed in a basket and lowered down through a window that's in the city wall, and I managed to escape. So he'd gone through a lot of stuff, even up to just here, before he went through his prison times. So when he said yes to God, he really said yes. He really did say yes, and for him it was very costly, but what a rich life he ended up living, and we get to benefit from that. It was quite a sacrifice, really. So after that, he ended up being arrested by the Romans and gone on a ship that took him all the way to Rome, where he had to appear before Caesar. We don't hear at the end of the book of Acts what happens to Paul. We just know he ends up in prison. But historically, we know what happened to Paul, and it's that he ended up being in prison in Rome for a few years. He wrote some of his final letters from there. These ones, Timothy. And then for being a Christian. Yep, and for preaching about Jesus. And he died from being beheaded in Rome. So that's quite intense. Most of Jesus' disciples ended up dying prematurely because of religious or political leaders that wanted to kill them. Only John did not die early, and he's the one that lived a much longer life, and he was still exiled on that island. But he's the one that wrote the book of Revelation, which is a very strange book. So, during the time of the book of Acts, I've just explained to you that Paul wrote all of these letters, but other people also wrote letters. So in the Bible, you also have the book of James. That's probably one of the first books that was written in the New Testament. And James was actually a brother of Jesus. So James was one of Mary and Joseph's sons. When Jesus was alive, his brothers didn't believe in him, but after he left, at least 2 of his brothers became believers, and James actually oversaw the church in Jerusalem, and he wrote the book of James. The other brother is Jude. So the book of Jude is written by Jesus' half-brother as well. And then Peter wrote 2 letters, John wrote 3 letters, and then Hebrews, we don't know who wrote Hebrews. It could have been Paul, but the languaging is a bit different than what Paul uses. It could have been Apollos or some of the other people in the book of Acts, or it could have been a woman. Normally if a woman wrote something, they didn't say that they wrote it because people wouldn't accept it. So we don't know who wrote Hebrews. And then the final book in the New Testament is Revelation. And Revelation has got really strange symbolism in it, like this one, which is the beast of the sea, which has 7 heads and horns and all kinds of things. It's not talking about real things, as in it's not talking about a real beast that has 7 heads. It's symbolizing leaders and countries and demonic forces and stuff that John was warning the people about, because in John's time, so in this time when Paul was in Acts, and he went to prison and so on, they really, really hated the Christian people. And there was a Roman emperor called Nero who was so strange in how he treated Christians. We've really come a long way. We might think that the world is crazy, but compared to back then, we've really come a long way. Nero would have Christians captured. He would tie them to poles in his garden, pour tar seal on them, and then light them up as some torches for him in his garden while he has his parties. Like, this is how these people were. Or they would sew someone inside the skin of an animal and then make them run around in the arena, let the lions out to tear them apart, and everyone would watch. Like, it's really crazy. So when John is writing the book of Revelation, he uses a lot of symbolic language so that it's not so obvious what he's saying, but it would have made sense for Christians in those days. And there's still stuff in it that makes sense for us now. But if we only take it as, this is only for us now and in the future, we're not reading it properly. It was also for them back then to understand and to follow. But we're not going to go into the book of Revelation today. The best way to read it is to read it in one go, because you won't understand it, but you'll start to get a feeling of, wow, God's in charge. everything's going to be okay. I can feel that God's in charge. So if you read it in bits, it's a bit weird and scary, but in one go, there's this overall feeling of everything's going to be okay. God's in charge and he sees what's going on. The last thing I want to show you is how do we know that the New Testament or the Old Testament is even real? Like, how do we know that? It was 2,000 years ago. How do we even know it was real? So this picture here, who's heard of Julius Caesar? Most people have heard of Julius Caesar, okay? So Caesar's at the top here. He lived just before Jesus, so 60 years, 40 years before Jesus. The first time the oldest manuscripts that talk, so there's only 10 manuscripts in history that even mention his name, and the oldest one is still 1,000 years after Julius Caesar lived, okay? So there's only 10, and the oldest one is still 1,000 years after he actually lived. But we take that and we say, no, that's cool, he lived. Yeah, we get that. The New Testament has 5,700 manuscripts, at least. These are big manuscripts. There's more than 1 million quotations as well. But there's 5,700 old manuscripts, like I showed you that parchment piece. And the oldest ones are like within 5 to 30 years of the actual events. So the evidence for the New Testament writing and the situations that happen, people were still alive that went through it during that time. There's still eyewitnesses there. I haven't heard of many of these people. Plato I have. There's another, Aristotle, Homer. We just take it and we say, yep. But then we often say, oh, no, but I don't know if Jesus is real. There's way, way much more evidence for Jesus than even any of these guys. So I just wanted to show you that. There's a lot of people that have done research on it, and you can find those manuscripts in museums in Britain, in Israel. There's heaps. You can go and look at those manuscripts and see them yourself. But obviously, they're in Aramaic or Greek or Hebrew language. Yep. Any questions about any of that? Yeah. Thank you. Next week's the last week for this module, and what I want to do next week is some practical, okay, so that's what's in the Bible, but how do I read the Bible now, 2,000 years later, and how can I apply it to my life? Like what? Because if I can't take everything from that culture and think that I need to use it in my culture, but there is stuff that I should be using. So how do I know the difference, and what do I take, and how do I read the Bible for me now? So that's what we're going to do next week. So it'll be good if you brought your Bible and journal or notebook, because we'll do some practical exploration of that. Okay? Questions?
For a new Christian,
Yep.
or not a new Christian, but learning to read the Bible, is it better to start with the Old Testament?
So for a new Christian who's learning to read the Bible, is it better to start in the Old Testament or the New Testament? So I would suggest you read about Jesus first. That would be my suggestion. So that's in the New Testament. So you would read, just going back to my little thing there. So you'd read one of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Matthew is written more for Jewish people, so probably wouldn't do that one. Mark is quite actiony and punchy, so that's quite a good one to read. Luke's got the detail, John's got the relationship. So any of those three. But you can't go wrong reading any of them.
To know Jesus more,
You'd read one of them.
build a better relationship in that respect. Would John be better? Is it John?
Yes, because John talks about Jesus' deity. But if you're wanting stories, I would probably do Mark or Luke.
No, only not so much stories.
The character, the person, the relational Jesus.
Yes, eternity.
Yep. John.
Especially when you're not a reader normally.
Mark. If you're not a reader, go for Mark. Trust me.
That's hard, no.
So if you're not a reader and you find reading hard, I would read Mark. Yep. Any other questions? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter which one you read, but Mark will be, an easier one to get into. Yep. And after that, if you want to do an Old Testament one, go for Genesis. Or if you want to do heart, stuff from your heart, do Psalms, which is poetry. But I would start with Mark.
Would you recommend any particular translation of the Bible? Or is
So the translations that we have, many of them are taken from the Greek translations and so on, so on. So the New King James is actually translated from the Old King James, which is translated in the 1600s from the Greek. So if you want to go for those New King James and NIV, they're probably the most accurate, but the languaging feels a bit clunky because it's taken from like the 1600s, and we don't talk like that very much anymore. So sometimes until you get used to it, it can be a bit hard reading the NIV or the New King James, but they're probably the more accurate ones. So if you're wanting something that's just flowing, easy to read, can just go with it, I'd go with the New Living Translation or the Passion. Yes, I use both NIV and New King James. Yeah.
I was thinking when we are actually reading sections of the Bible,
Yep.
in class and so forth, it helps if we're all in one book.
Oh, no, it actually helps if you've got a few different translations and you can read the same thing in a few different translations. Mm.
Can make it very confusing for people reading these things for the first time.
But generally it's saying the same thing. Yeah.
Passion translation, that's a good one, isn't it?
Yeah, the Passion Translation is written in modern flowing English. Yep.
I've got one, but I haven't read it.
Yep. It's an easier one to read.
More understanding of it.
And New Living Translation is also easier to read. Yep, it's good. The only thing with the Passion Translation is there's not an Old Testament part of it yet. They're still writing it. So they've got all the New Testament, and then they've got Psalms and Proverbs and Isaiah. Maybe? Yes? Okay. Yep. So they're busy working through that at the moment. Any other questions? Cool. Bless you. If you want to finish off those quizzes, you're welcome to. I've got more chocolate and lollies. Yeah, go for it. Thank you, everyone.